her dangerous love for the enemy. Livia Marchesi had once been royalty in their world until her father's empire crumbled and she was left with nothing but enemies. She had spent a year in hiding, but now he had found her. Rafael Costa exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You look good for a dead woman," he murmured. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Palazzo Marchesi. The chipped teacup trembled in Livia's hand, a delicate shiver mirroring the tremor that had taken root deep within her bones. It had been a year since the opulent world she'd known had shattered like a dropped crystal goblet, leaving behind only jagged edges and the bitter taste of betrayal. A year since she'd become a ghost, a whisper in the corridors of a life that no longer existed. The once grand Palazzo Marchesi, now just a shell of its former glory, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the heavy, drawn curtains, illuminating the faded grandeur of the room. She traced the rim of the cup, a relic from a time when her days were filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes, not the gnawing silence of fear. The porcelain was cold, a stark contrast to the burning anxiety that coiled in her stomach. Outside, the vibrant pulse of Rome hummed, a distant symphony of life that she was no longer a part of. She was a shadow, clinging to the edges of a city that had once bowed at her family's feet. A floorboard creaked outside the drawing room door, and Livia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but in the suffocating silence of the palazzo, it echoed like a gunshot. She set the cup down with painstaking care, the clink against the saucer sounding deafeningly loud in her ears. She rose, her movements stiff and hesitant, and moved towards the dusty, velvet curtains, peering through a sliver-thin gap. The courtyard below, once meticulously manicured, was now overgrown with weeds, a testament to her neglect and the crumbling state of her life. A figure moved through the shadows, tall and imposing, his presence radiating a silent power that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. Even from this distance, shrouded in the dim light, she recognized him. Raffaele Costa. The breath hitched in her throat, a strangled gasp lost in the stillness of the room. Raffaele Costa. Her father's associate. A man of darkness, of whispers and veiled threats, a man who moved with the lethal grace of a panther. A man who, by all rights, should have wanted her dead. The Costa family had been rivals, allies, enemies, their relationship with the Marchesi a tangled web of blood and betrayal that stretched back generations. Her father, Don Alessandro Marchesi, had once controlled Rome's underworld with an iron fist, his name synonymous with power and fear. But power was a fickle mistress, and betrayal, a constant companion. One wrong move, one misjudgment, and the empire he had built had come crashing down, leaving Livia, his only child, to pick through the wreckage. She'd run, hidden, erased herself as best she could. She'd thought she'd succeeded. Raphael moved with a predatory stillness, his dark eyes scanning the overgrown courtyard, the crumbling facade of the palazzo. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the shadows, a stark contrast to the faded elegance of his surroundings. He paused, his head tilting slightly, as if he sensed her presence, her fear, a tangible thing hanging in the air. Livia's fingers tightened on the curtain, her knuckles white. She should run. Hide. But there was nowhere left to go. She was trapped, a butterfly pinned beneath the unwavering gaze of a predator. He had found her. After all this time, after all her efforts to disappear, Rafael Costa had found the ghost of Palazzo Marchesi. A slow, deliberate smile curved his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He knew she was watching. The game of cat and mouse was over. He moved towards the palazzo's main entrance, his footsteps echoing on the cracked marble steps. Livia backed away from the window, her mind racing, a whirlwind of fear and a strange, unsettling flicker of something else. Relief? Resignation? Perhaps a morbid curiosity. The heavy oak door creaked open, the sound reverberating through the silent house. His presence filled the space, an invisible force that pressed against her, stealing the air from her lungs. She stood in the center of the drawing room, her back straight, her chin lifted, a fragile imitation of the composure she had once possessed. She would not cower. She was a Marchese, even a broken one. He appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He paused, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in the worn elegance of her simple dress, the shadows under her eyes, the defiant tilt of her chin. He exhaled slowly, the sound a soft rasp in the silence. "You look good for a dead woman," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine. He moved further into the room, and the way he moved told that he came here as someone in charge, not as a simple guest. The scent of him reached her then, a subtle blend of expensive cologne and something darker, something wilder, that hinted at the danger that clung to him like a second skin. It was a scent she remembered, a scent that had always both intrigued and terrified her. The question, a cold knot of dread in her stomach, was, why was he here? Not to kill her, surely. He'd had ample opportunity in the past year. So what? What did Rafael Costa want with the broken remnants of the Marchese Empire? What did he want with her? Chapter 2. Echoes of a Fallen Empire. Livia didn't answer, her gaze locked on his. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, though it clawed at her throat, making it difficult to breathe. The years hadn't changed him much. Rafael Costa was still a formidable presence, his dark hair perfectly styled, his jawline sharp and uncompromising, his eyes, those eyes were the same, dark and intense, holding a depth of secrets she couldn't begin to fathom. They were the eyes of a hunter, patient and unwavering. He took another step closer, the distance between them shrinking, the air in the room growing thick with unspoken tension. "I've been looking for you, Livia," he said, his voice a low caress that belied the steel beneath. "A year is a long time to be a ghost."
"Why?"
The word escaped her lips, a raspy whisper that betrayed her composure. He tilted his head, a slight, almost mocking gesture. "Why do you think?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "Your father left a mess. A considerable one. And messes need to be cleaned up. And you think I'm part of that mess?" Her voice was stronger now, fueled by a flicker of defiance. She might be broken, but she wasn't defeated. Raphael's lips curved into that same unsettling smile. "You are the key to that mess, Livia. The last surviving piece of the Marchese puzzle." She laughed, a hollow, brittle sound. "There's nothing left."
"My father saw to that."
She gestured around the decaying room, a sweeping motion that encompassed the faded grandeur, the dust, the emptiness. "This is all that remains. Ruins and memories." He didn't respond to her outburst. Instead, he continued to study her, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, the way she held herself. It was an assessment, a careful calculation, as if he were weighing her worth, her potential, her danger. "Your father was a complicated man," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "He had many secrets. Secrets that died with him. Secrets that others are very interested in." Livia's heart clenched. "Secrets? What secrets?" "He told me everything." It was a lie, of course. Her father had always kept a part of himself hidden, a world of shadows and whispers that she had only glimpsed from the periphery. Raphael raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge to her statement. "Did he, Livia? Did he tell you about the accordo? The agreement he made with the other families? The one that kept the peace, and the one that was broken? The accordo. The agreement." She knew of it, of course, the fragile pact that had bound the ruling families of Rome's underworld together for decades. A pact built on mutual respect, shared territory, and the constant threat of violence. A pact that her father had, apparently, violated. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, the lie sticking in her throat. He stepped even closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the subtle, intoxicating scent of his cologne. "Don't insult my intelligence, Livia. You may have been playing the innocent princess, but you were always your father's daughter. You knew more than you let on." His words were a low, dangerous murmur, a threat veiled in a silken tone. He was right, of course. She had known. Not the specifics, perhaps, but she had always sensed the undercurrent of danger, the unspoken rules, the precarious balance of power that governed her father's world. "And what if I did?" she challenged, her voice trembling slightly. "What difference does it make now? He's gone. The accordo is broken. The empire is dust." Raphael reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting, electric touch that sent a shiver through her. She flinched, but didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the menace in his eyes. "It makes all the difference, Kara," he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because the other families, they believe you know where it is." "Where what is?" Her confusion was genuine this time. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "The tesoro. Your father's hidden treasure. The money, the documents, the secrets, everything he took with him to the grave. They believe you know its location. And they're not going to stop until they find it." Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. A hidden treasure? It sounded like something out of a storybook, a fantastical tale spun to entertain children. But the look in Raphael's eyes, the intensity of his gaze, told her that this was no fairy tale. This was real. This was dangerous. I don't know anything about a treasure," she whispered, the words barely audible. His hand moved from her cheek to her throat, his fingers gently circling her neck, a possessive, almost protective gesture. "Then you'll have to learn, Livia," he said softly, "because your life depends on it." His eyes held hers. It felt like a promise, and like a threat, and she did not know if she should trust his words or to run as fast as she could. But in that moment, she saw something behind his guarded gaze. It looked like pain. How could such a dangerous man carry such pain? Chapter 3. The serpent's unexpected courtesy. The pressure of his fingers on her throat, though gentle, was a constant reminder of his power, of her vulnerability. It was a calculated move, a subtle demonstration of dominance that left her breathless and unnerved. Yet, there was something else in his touch, a strange hesitancy, a hint of protection. It was a confusing dichotomy, the serpent offering a semblance of courtesy. "Come with me," he said, his voice losing some of its harsh edge. "This place, it holds too many memories. Too many ghosts." Livia hesitated. Leaving the palazzo, even in its dilapidated state, felt like severing the last tie to her past, to the life she had known. It was a terrifying prospect, stepping out into the unknown, placing her trust in the hands of a man who was, by all accounts, her enemy. But staying was no longer an option. He had made that abundantly clear. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Somewhere safe," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Somewhere they won't find you." "And why would you do that?" she challenged, suspicion lacing her words. "Why protect me? You should be the one hunting for this tesoro." Raphael's lips curved into a faint smile, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. "Let's just say I have my reasons. And your father owed me a debt. A considerable one." A debt. Another layer to the tangled web of secrets and obligations that had defined her family's existence. It seemed that, even in death, her father continued to cast a long shadow over her life. "And you think I can repay that debt?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You can," he affirmed, his gaze holding hers. "By helping me find what he hid. By helping me clean up his mess." The word help sounded strange coming from him, almost incongruous with his predatory nature. It suggested a partnership, a collaboration, a concept that seemed utterly foreign in their world of power plays and betrayals. She looked around the decaying drawing room, at the faded tapestries, the dusty furniture, the ghosts of memories that clung to the air like cobwebs. It was a prison, albeit a familiar one. Leaving was a risk, but staying was a guarantee of continued fear, of living in the shadow of her past. "All right," she conceded, the word a reluctant exhale. "I'll go with you." A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face, quickly masked by his usual impassive expression.
Good.
We leave tonight. Pack a bag. Only the essentials. Tonight? She repeated, her heart skipping a beat. The suddenness of it all was overwhelming. The sooner we disappear, the better, he said, his voice firm. They'll be watching. Waiting. He released her, the absence of his touch leaving a strange void, a coldness that seeped into her bones. He turned and walked towards the door, his movements fluid and silent, the epitome of controlled power. Be ready, he said, without turning back. I'll be back at sunset. And then he was gone, leaving Livia alone in the echoing silence of the palazzo, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air, a tangible reminder of the danger and the strange, unsettling promise that had just entered her life. She had a few hours to pack a bag, to say goodbye to the ghost of her past, and to prepare herself for a future that was as uncertain as it was terrifying. She walked over to the dusty window, watching as his figure disappeared down the overgrown drive. The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, yet ominous backdrop to her impending departure. She touched the cold glass of the window, her reflection staring back at her, a pale, haunted image of the woman she once was. The broken queen. But perhaps, just perhaps, with Rafael Costa as her unlikely protector, she might find a way to reclaim some semblance of power, some semblance of herself. The question remained, however, at what cost? And as the last sliver of sun vanished, casting long, dark shadows across the room, a shiver of unease ran down her spine. She knew, deep down, that this journey would test her in ways she couldn't even imagine. And she was not sure if that feeling growing inside her was a simple fear or anticipation. Chapter 4. A Cage of Gilded Promises. Sunset bled into a bruised twilight as Livia descended the grand, curving staircase of the palazzo, a small, worn leather suitcase clutched in her hand. It contained a meager collection of clothes, a few treasured photographs, and a small, silver locket that had belonged to her mother, the only tangible reminders of a life that felt a lifetime ago. The silence of the house pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the stairs beneath her feet. She reached the bottom and paused, her gaze sweeping over the vast, empty entrance hall. The marble floors, once polished to a mirror sheen, were now dull and cracked, reflecting the dim light from the single flickering chandelier that remained. It was a scene of faded grandeur, a poignant reminder of the swift and brutal fall of the Marquesi Empire. A sharp rap at the door echoed through the hall, making her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Raphael. He was punctual, as she expected he would be. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and moved towards the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the heavy, ornate handle. She pulled it open, revealing Raphael standing on the threshold, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky. He was dressed in dark clothes, blending seamlessly with the shadows, a predator ready to stalk the night. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something softer, a hint of concern. It was a fleeting expression, quickly masked, but it was enough to make her pause. Ready? He asked, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling anticipation. He stepped inside, his presence filling the vast hall, diminishing the emptiness. He glanced at the suitcase in her hand, a slight nod of approval. Good. Let's go. He didn't offer to take the suitcase, didn't offer any further words of comfort or reassurance. He simply turned and walked towards a sleek, black car parked discreetly at the edge of the overgrown drive, its engine already purring softly. It was a car designed for speed and anonymity, a stark contrast to the ostentatious displays of wealth that had once characterized her family's vehicles. Livia followed him, her footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of the city. She glanced back at the palazzo, its darkened windows staring back at her like empty eyes, a silent farewell to a life she could never reclaim. She climbed into the passenger seat of the car, the leather cool and smooth beneath her. Raphael started the engine, the powerful hum filling the silence. He glanced at her, his gaze intense and unreadable. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the engine's rumble. "To my apartment," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's secure." His apartment. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She was stepping into his world, a world she knew nothing about, a world that was undoubtedly dangerous. She was placing herself entirely in his power, trusting him to protect her from the very forces he represented. He pulled away from the curb, the car gliding smoothly through the deserted streets. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of color that seemed a world away from the quiet darkness of the palazzo. Livia watched the passing scene, her mind racing, a whirlwind of questions and anxieties. The drive was silent, punctuated only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Livia. Raphael drove with a focused intensity, his hands firm on the wheel, his gaze constantly scanning the mirrors, alert to any sign of danger. He was a man on a mission, a man who took his responsibilities seriously, even if those responsibilities now included protecting the daughter of his former rival. Finally, he pulled into the underground garage of a modern, luxurious apartment building, a stark contrast to the crumbling grandeur of the palazzo. The building was sleek and anonymous, its glass and steel facade reflecting the city lights, hiding its secrets behind a veil of anonymity. He parked the car and turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "We're here. Don't speak to anyone. Don't leave the apartment without me. Understand?" His words were a command, not a request. Livia nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She understood. She was a prisoner, albeit one in a gilded cage. He was offering her protection, but at a price. Her freedom, her independence, and perhaps something more. He led her through the silent, sterile corridors of the building to a private elevator that whisked them up to the top floor. The apartment was as modern and impersonal as the building itself, all clean lines and minimalist decor, devoid of any personal touches. It was a space designed for efficiency, not comfort, a reflection of the man who inhabited it. He showed her to a guest room, a spacious, elegantly furnished room with a large bed, a walk-in closet, and a private bathroom. It was luxurious, yet sterile, lacking any sense of warmth or personality. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I'll be in the study if you need anything." He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway, his back to her. "Livia," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it before. "I know this is difficult, but I will keep you safe. You have my word." It was a promise, a vow spoken with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver through her. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? She watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone in the silence of her gilded cage, the city lights twinkling outside the window, a constant reminder of the world she had lost and the uncertain future that lay ahead. She looked at the bed. Should she rest? She had the feeling she was going to need her strength very, very soon. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Shadowed Garden. Livia barely slept. The luxurious bed, with its crisp, white linens, felt foreign and uncomfortable. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the encounter with Raphael, the flight from the palazzo, the unsettling promise of protection in his sterile, modern apartment. She tossed and turned, the silence of the room amplifying her anxieties. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, sent a jolt of fear through her. As dawn approached, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and pink, she finally gave up on sleep. She rose and dressed in a simple black dress, one of the few items she had salvaged from her former life. The fabric felt soft and familiar against her skin, a small comfort in this alien environment. She ventured out of the guest room, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The apartment was still shrouded in darkness, the heavy curtains drawn against the morning light. She moved through the living room, a vast, empty space dominated by a large, black leather sofa and a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the city. The kitchen was equally modern and impersonal, all stainless steel and gleaming surfaces. She found a coffee machine and managed to brew herself a strong cup, the bitter aroma filling the air, a small reminder of normalcy. She carried the cup to the window, sipping the hot liquid as she gazed out at the waking city. The view was breathtaking, a sprawling tapestry of rooftops, church domes, and ancient monuments, all bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun. But Livia barely noticed the beauty. Her mind was focused on Raphael, on the secrets he held, on the danger that surrounded them both. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Raphael stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark shirt and trousers, his hair slightly tousled, as if he hadn't slept either. He looked different in the soft morning light, less intimidating, more human. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, sipping her coffee.
Couldn't sleep.
He moved into the kitchen, his presence filling the space. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate and economical. "We need to talk," he said, his gaze meeting hers. Livia braced herself. She knew this conversation was coming, the inevitable discussion of the tesoro, of her father's secrets, of the danger that awaited them. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. He leaned against the counter, his dark eyes studying her. "About your father. About what he hid. About who's looking for it." "I told you. I don't know anything," she repeated, the life feeling heavier on her tongue this time. He sighed, a hint of frustration in his voice. "Livia, I understand your fear. But you need to trust me. If we're going to survive this, we need to work together."
Trust.
The word hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across a chasm of suspicion and fear. Could she trust him? He was Acosta, a man of the underworld, a man who had every reason to betray her. And yet there was something in his eyes, a sincerity, a hint of vulnerability, that made her want to believe him. "There's a garden," he said, changing the subject abruptly. "Downstairs. A private courtyard. We can talk there." The garden. A small, unexpected oasis in the heart of this concrete jungle. It was a surprising suggestion, a hint of a different side to Raphael, a side that wasn't all steel and shadows. They took the elevator down to the ground floor and stepped out into a hidden courtyard, a secluded space enclosed by high walls, overgrown with lush greenery. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of flowers and damp earth. A small fountain gurgled softly in the center, its gentle sound a soothing counterpoint to the city's distant hum. Raphael led her to a stone bench nestled beneath a flowering vine, its delicate blossoms casting dappled shadows on the ground. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle murmur of the fountain and the distant chirping of birds. "My grandfather built this," Raphael said, his voice softer than usual, a hint of nostalgia in his tone. "He loved gardens, said they were a reminder of peace, in a world that knows very little of it." Livia looked at him, surprised by this unexpected glimpse into his family history. It was a reminder that he was more than just a cold, calculating mafia boss. He was a man with a past, with connections, with perhaps even a heart. He turned to her, his gaze intense. "Your father, he trusted my grandfather. They had an understanding, a bond that went beyond the usual alliances." Livia's heart skipped a beat. This was new information, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't known existed. "What kind of understanding?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Raphael hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "The kind that involves secrets, Livia," he said softly. "Secrets that could destroy everything. Secrets that your father entrusted to my grandfather. And that my grandfather, before dying, entrusted to me." His words made her question everything she knew. What kind of game her father was playing? Chapter 6. The Weight of Unforgiven Sins. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the humid air of the enclosed garden. Livia stared at Raphael, her mind struggling to process his words. Her father, the stoic, unyielding Don Alessandro Marchesi, had entrusted a secret, a potentially devastating secret, to his rival's grandfather? It seemed impossible, a betrayal of everything she thought she knew about her family, about the rigid code of honor that governed their world. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Why would he do that? Why trust Acosta?" Raphael sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of weariness that belied his usual composure. "Because he had no choice, Livia," he said softly. "Because the secret was too dangerous, too volatile, to keep within his own family. Because he knew that if it fell into the wrong hands, it would ignite a war that would consume us all." A war. The word sent a shiver down her spine. The accordo, the fragile peace between the families, had always been precarious, a delicate balance maintained by mutual fear and the constant threat of violence. Her father's secret, it seemed, had the potential to shatter that balance, to unleash a storm of bloodshed and chaos. "But what is the secret?" she pressed, her voice urgent. "What could be so dangerous?" Raphael hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to reveal the truth. He looked out at the garden, at the delicate blossoms of the flowering vine, at the gentle play of light and shadow. "It's complicated," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "It involves betrayals, old sins, things that were buried but never forgotten. Tell me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I need to know. I need to understand." He turned back to her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. "Your father, he wasn't always the man you knew," he began, his voice heavy with unspoken emotions. "He made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. He betrayed the accordo. He made deals with outsiders. Enemies of all the families." Livia's breath hitched in her throat. This was worse than she had imagined. Her father, the pillar of strength, the embodiment of honor, had been a traitor? It was a devastating revelation, a blow to the very foundation of her identity. "And these outsiders, they want something in return?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Raphael nodded. "They want what he promised them. Power. Control. And they believe the tesoro, your father's hidden treasure, holds the key to that power." The tesoro again. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't just about money or documents. It was about something far more significant, something that could shift the balance of power in the entire underworld. "But I don't know where it is," she repeated, her voice laced with desperation. "I swear I don't." Raphael studied her, his gaze intense and unwavering, as if he were trying to see into her soul, to discern the truth from the lies. "I believe you," he finally said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But they won't. They'll keep coming for you, Livia, until they find what they're looking for. Or until they're convinced you truly don't know." His words sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She was trapped, caught in a web of her father's sins, hunted by forces she didn't understand. And her only protector, her only hope, was this man, this enigmatic, dangerous man who held his own secrets, his own burdens. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Raphael reached out, his hand covering hers, a surprisingly warm and comforting gesture. "We find it," he said, his voice firm. "We find the tesoro before they do. And we use it to protect ourselves. To protect what's left of our families." His words were a promise, a vow, but also a warning. This was a dangerous game, a race against time and deadly enemies. And the stakes were higher than she could ever have imagined. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't only see shadows and steel. This time she was certain. There was pain and something softer. Compassion? Was it possible? Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Silk. The weight of his hand on hers, the unexpected warmth of his touch, sent a ripple of conflicting emotions through Livia. It was a gesture of comfort, of reassurance, yet it also served as a reminder of their precarious situation, of the dangerous alliance they had forged. She was acutely aware of the contrast between them, the broken Marchesi princess and the ruthless Costa heir, bound together by a shared threat and a legacy of secrets. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How do we find something that's been hidden for years, something my father guarded so carefully? Raphael withdrew his hand, the absence of his touch leaving a sudden chill. He rose from the bench and began to pace slowly along the stone path, his movements fluid and restless, like a caged predator. Your father left clues, he said, his voice thoughtful. He was meticulous. He wouldn't have left something so important without a way to retrieve it. We just need to find those clues. Clues? Where? Livia asked, frustration creeping into her voice. I've searched the palazzo. There's nothing there. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his dark eyes intense. Not in the palazzo, Livia. Of the palazzo. Your father, he loved that place. It was more than just a house. It was a symbol, a repository of his memories, his triumphs and his failures. His words sparked a flicker of understanding in Livia's mind. She had always known that her father had a deep connection to the palazzo, a sentimental attachment that went beyond its material value. He had spent hours wandering its halls, tending to its gardens, preserving its history. He had treated it almost like a living thing. You think the clues are hidden within the structure itself? She asked, her voice gaining strength. In the walls? The floors? Raphael nodded.
Possibly.
Or in the objects within it. The paintings, the sculptures, the furniture. Your father was a collector. He surrounded himself with beauty, with history. Each piece had a story. And perhaps one of those stories holds the key. The idea was daunting, yet also intriguing. It was like a treasure hunt, a puzzle to be solved, a way to connect with her father, even in death. And it was a way to fight back, to reclaim some control over her own destiny. We need to go back, she said, her voice firm. We need to search the palazzo again. Properly this time. Raphael hesitated. It's dangerous, Livia. They could be watching. Waiting. I don't care, she retorted, her defiance flaring. I'm not going to hide here, waiting for them to find me. I'm going to find the tesoro first. And I'm going to use it to. She trailed off, unsure of what she would do with the tesoro once she found it. Revenge? Justice? Protection? The possibilities were overwhelming, the implications terrifying. Raphael studied her, his gaze softening slightly. He saw the fire in her eyes, the flicker of the Marchese spirit that had been dimmed but not extinguished. He saw the woman she was capable of becoming, the strength that lay hidden beneath the scars of her past. All right, he conceded, a faint smile playing on his lips. We go back. Tonight. He reached out and touched her arm, a fleeting, electric contact that sent a shiver through her. But we do it my way, Livia, he said, his voice low and firm. We go in quietly. We search systematically. And we leave no trace. His words were a reminder of his authority, of the power he wielded. But they were also a promise of protection, of guidance, of a shared purpose. She nodded, her gaze meeting his. As they walked back towards the apartment, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was a silence born not of awkwardness, but of a shared understanding, a mutual respect that was slowly beginning to grow between them. Later that evening, as Livia prepared for their return to the palazzo, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She saw a woman who was still afraid, still uncertain, but also determined. She saw a flicker of the woman she had once been, the woman she thought she had lost forever. And she realized that Raphael Costa, the serpent, the enemy, was also, unexpectedly, her catalyst. He was forcing her to confront her past, to embrace her heritage, to fight for her future. And she could not deny to herself she felt something more. Was it fear? Or the thrill of something forbidden? As she looked at her own eyes in the mirror, she wasn't able to answer that.
Yet.
Chapter 8. A dance of defiance and desire. Night had fallen, cloaking Rome in a veil of shadows and secrets. The city lights twinkled like fallen stars, a deceptive beauty that masked the dangers lurking beneath. Livia stood beside Raphael in the underground garage, the air thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and the hum of unseen machinery. He was dressed in black, blending seamlessly with the darkness, a predator ready to reclaim his territory. She, too, was dressed in dark clothing, a simple black dress and a lightweight jacket, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She felt a nervous energy coursing through her veins, a mixture of fear and anticipation. Returning to the palazzo was a risk, a dangerous gamble, but it was a risk she was willing to take. Raphael handed her a small, powerful flashlight. "Stay close to me," he instructed, his voice a low murmur. "Don't speak unless necessary. And, if anything happens, run. Don't wait for me." His words were a stark reminder of the danger they faced, but they also contained a hint of protectiveness, a concern for her safety that surprised her. She nodded, her throat tight with unspoken emotions. They drove through the silent streets, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness, the only sound the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic beat of her heart. Raphael drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors, alert to any sign of pursuit. They reached the palazzo, its dark, looming silhouette rising against the night sky, a ghostly reminder of its former glory. The overgrown drive crunched beneath the tires as Raphael parked the car discreetly behind a cluster of overgrown bushes, hidden from view. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wasn't ready, not really, but she would never admit it. She was a Marchese, and Marcheses didn't show fear. They slipped out of the car and moved silently through the shadows, towards a side entrance that Raphael had, apparently, used before. He produced a set of lockpicks from his pocket, his movements swift and practiced, and within seconds, the door clicked open. They stepped inside, the musty air of the palazzo hitting them like a physical blow. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet and the distant sounds of the city. Livia shivered, the familiar scent of dust and decay triggering a flood of memories, both good and bad. Raphael led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the faded grandeur of the interior. They moved through the silent rooms, ghosts in a haunted house, searching for clues, for any sign of her father's hidden legacy. They started in the library, a vast, high-ceilinged room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with ancient tomes and leather-bound volumes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a testament to years of neglect. Raphael moved along the shelves, his fingers trailing over the spines of the books, his eyes scanning for anything out of place, any hint of a hidden compartment or a secret message. Livia followed close behind, her flashlight beam illuminating the titles, searching for anything that might be familiar, anything that might spark a memory. Hours passed, and the silence was unbroken, except the silent question in their eyes, every time their gazes met. The tension built up, and Livia was starting to feel the weight of their search. Suddenly, Raphael stopped. He was standing in front of a large, ornate fireplace, his gaze fixed on the intricate carvings that adorned the mantelpiece. Livia moved closer, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer, his fingers tracing the outline of a carved serpent, coiled around a staff, the Marchese family crest. He pressed on a specific point of the carving, and a faint click echoed through the room. A section of the mantelpiece slid open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Livia gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. They had found something. Raphael reached into the compartment and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was old and worn, its pages yellowed with age, its cover embossed with the same serpent crest. He opened the book carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. Livia leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the intricate handwriting on the first page. It was her father's. He turned to her with a question in his eyes. Something was changing.
She could feel that.
He looked vulnerable. She felt desire rising inside her. It was not the moment. She pushed that feeling away. But for how long? Chapter 9. The Lion's Guarded Heart. The discovery of the hidden book sent a jolt of adrenaline through Livia. It was tangible proof that her father had, indeed, left behind clues, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to his tesoro. The sight of his handwriting, so familiar yet now imbued with a sense of mystery and danger, brought a lump to her throat. Raphael carefully turned the pages of the book, his brow furrowed in concentration. The pages were filled with a mixture of Italian and coded entries, a complex cipher that would take time to unravel. Livia peered over his shoulder, trying to decipher the script, but it was like looking at a foreign language. "Can you understand it?" she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and frustration. Raphael shook his head slowly. "Some of it," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "It's a combination of personal notes, financial records, and something else. Something I don't quite understand yet." He closed the book and looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "This is just the beginning, Livia," he said. "This book, it's a map to the tesoro. But it's not going to be easy to follow. We'll figure it out," she said, her voice firm, her determination fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. Together. The word together hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of their growing bond, of the unlikely partnership they had formed. They were two sides of the same coin, rivals by birth, allies by necessity, bound together by a shared quest and a growing, unspoken attraction. Raphael nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "We will," he affirmed, "but we need to be careful. This book, it's dangerous. It could lead us to the tesoro, but it could also lead us into a trap." He tucked the book inside his jacket, close to his chest, as if protecting it from unseen forces.
"We should go," he said.
"We've been here too long." They retraced their steps, moving silently through the darkened palazzo, their senses on high alert. The discovery of the book had changed the atmosphere, adding a new layer of tension, a heightened sense of danger. They reached the side entrance and slipped out into the night, the cool air a welcome relief after the stuffy confines of the palazzo. They walked quickly to the car, their footsteps echoing on the gravel drive. As Raphael started the engine, Livia glanced back at the palazzo, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. It was no longer just a symbol of her past, a reminder of her loss. It was now a puzzle to be solved, a key to her future. The drive back to Raphael's apartment was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was a silence filled with shared purpose, with a growing understanding, with the unspoken tension of their burgeoning connection. Once inside the apartment, Raphael placed the book on a large, mahogany desk in his study, a room filled with bookshelves, maps, and antique globes, a reflection of his intellectual curiosity and his strategic mind. He poured them both a glass of wine, a silent offering of comfort and a way to ease the tension of the night. Livia took the glass, her fingers brushing against his, a fleeting contact that sent a shiver through her. She sipped the wine, the rich, dark liquid warming her from the inside out. Raphael stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, his back to her. He seemed lost in thought, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching hers. "I'm thinking about your father," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "About why he chose to hide the tesoro. About who he was trying to protect, and who he was trying to protect it from." "And?" Livia prompted, her curiosity piqued. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And I'm thinking about you," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "About how you've changed since I found you. About the strength I see in you, the fire, the resilience." His words surprised her, sending a warmth spreading through her chest. She had been so focused on her own fears, her own struggles, that she hadn't realized how he perceived her. She had thought he saw her as a burden, a liability, a pawn in his game. But his words suggested something more, something deeper. He took a step closer, his gaze holding hers. "You're not broken, Livia," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You're wounded, but you're healing. And you're stronger than you think." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked at him, wanting to get lost in his dark eyes. The air was so thick between them. She felt it. And she was almost sure he felt that too. Chapter 10. Cracks in the Costa facade. His words, spoken with such quiet intensity, resonated deep within her, chipping away at the walls she had built around her heart. The tears that welled in her eyes were not tears of sadness, but of a strange, unfamiliar relief, a release of the pent-up emotions she had been carrying for so long. He saw her, not as the broken Marquesi princess, but as a woman of strength, of resilience, a woman capable of healing. She took a shaky breath, trying to regain her composure. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice trembling. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a stray tear. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through her, a warmth that spread from the point of contact to every nerve ending in her body. You don't have to say anything, he murmured, his voice a low, husky rumble that sent a tremor through her. His eyes were dark and intense, filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher: desire, tenderness, and something else, something that looked like vulnerability, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of the ruthless Costier. The distance between them seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with unspoken tension, with the magnetic pull of their undeniable attraction. It was a dangerous dance, a forbidden desire, a collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. Livia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the turmoil within her. She knew she should step away, break the spell, maintain the distance that was necessary for their survival. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, to his strength, to his vulnerability, to the unexpected tenderness he had shown her. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. Livia, he whispered, her name a soft caress that sent a shiver down her spine. She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by his proximity, by the scent of his cologne, by the warmth of his body. She was lost in the moment, adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions, torn between fear and desire, between duty and passion. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch, a silent plea for permission. It was a feather-light contact, a mere whisper of a kiss, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, igniting a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in, surrendering to the moment, to the forbidden desire that had been building between them. He deepened the kiss, his arms encircling her waist, pulling her closer, his embrace both possessive and protective. It was a kiss born of desperation, of shared fear, of a growing understanding that transcended their family's history, their rivalries, their differences. It was a kiss that tasted of danger and desire, of hope and despair, of the fragile, uncertain future that lay ahead. But as their passion intensified, a sudden noise from the hallway shattered the moment, a sharp, intrusive sound that brought them crashing back to reality. They broke apart, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding. Raphael stepped back, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and frustration. I shouldn't have done that, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Livia shook her head, her cheeks flushed, her mind reeling. It's all right, she stammered, unable to meet his gaze. The moment was broken, the spell shattered. The reality of their situation came crashing down on them, the dangers they faced, the obstacles they had to overcome, the forbidden nature of their connection. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of agitation. We need to focus, he said, his voice regaining its usual firmness. We need to decipher the book. We need to find the tesoro. She nodded, her heart still racing, her body still tingling from his touch. She knew he was right. They couldn't afford to be distracted, to let their emotions cloud their judgment. But the kiss had changed everything. It had crossed a line, blurred the boundaries, ignited a fire that would be difficult, if not impossible, to extinguish. She looked at him, and the question was there, unspoken.
What now?
The noise saved them again. But for how long they could ignore what was happening between them? Chapter 11. Blood and betrayal under the moon. The sharp, intrusive noise that had shattered their moment of intimacy turned out to be the insistent ringing of Raphael's phone. He answered it quickly, his expression hardening as he listened to the voice on the other end. Livia watched him, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of dread. The brief respite, the fleeting connection they had shared, was over. The realities of their world, the dangers that lurked in the shadows, had come crashing back. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as he ended the call. His face was grim, his jaw tight with tension. "Trouble," he replied, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion.
"One of my men, he was attacked."
"Near the docks." The docks. A known territory of the Salerni family, one of the most ruthless and powerful families in Rome's underworld, and long-standing rivals of both the Costas and the Marquesses. This was no random act of violence. It was a message. A challenge. Attacked? By who? Livia asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Salerni," Raphael confirmed, his eyes dark with anger. "They're making a move. They know about the Tesoro. They're trying to flush us out." Livia's blood ran cold. The Salernists were known for their brutality, their ruthlessness, their complete disregard for the Accordo, the fragile peace that had governed the underworld for decades. If they were involved, the situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Raphael was already moving, his mind clearly racing, formulating a plan. "We need to get out of here," he said. "This apartment, it's no longer safe. They know where I live." He grabbed the leather-bound book from the desk, tucking it securely inside his jacket. "We need to go somewhere they won't expect. Somewhere off the grid." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Do you trust me, Livia?" he asked, the question hanging in the air, a test of the fragile bond they had formed. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She did trust him, despite everything, despite the dangers, despite the forbidden attraction that simmered between them. She had seen his vulnerability, his protectiveness, his unexpected tenderness. She had seen the cracks in the Costa facade. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm. "I trust you." He led her quickly out of the apartment, down the elevator, and into the underground garage. They got into the car, the engine roaring to life, and Raphael sped out of the garage, tires screeching against the concrete. He drove through the darkened streets, his movements precise and controlled, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of color and shadow, a backdrop to their desperate flight. They drove for hours, leaving Rome behind, heading towards the coast, towards a destination that Livia didn't know. The silence in the car was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Livia. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, they arrived at a secluded villa, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was a beautiful, isolated spot, surrounded by lush vegetation, hidden from prying eyes. Raphael parked the car and turned to her, his face etched with fatigue and concern. "We're safe here for now," he said, his voice weary. "This is a family property.
No one knows about it."
He led her inside the villa, which was surprisingly well maintained, furnished in a rustic, elegant style, a stark contrast to his modern apartment in Rome. It felt like a sanctuary, a place of refuge from the storm that was raging around them. As Livia looked around, she noticed a small, almost unnoticeable bloodstain on Raphael's sleeve. "You are hurt," she said, approaching him. Raphael looked at his sleeve, and then back to Livia. "It's nothing," he said. But she knew better. He was hiding his pain. But she also knew he would not accept her help. Not now, not yet. The night was far from being over. Chapter 12. The Price of Protection. Livia didn't press him about the bloodstain, sensing his reluctance to show any sign of weakness. She knew that in his world, vulnerability was a liability, a chink in the armor that could be exploited by his enemies. But she also knew that he was human, that he felt pain, that he carried the weight of his responsibilities, of his family's legacy, on his shoulders. She watched him as he moved through the villa, checking the windows and doors, securing their temporary refuge. He moved with a practiced efficiency, a silent vigilance that spoke volumes about the dangers he had faced throughout his life. He was a warrior, a protector, a man accustomed to living on the edge, to constantly looking over his shoulder. "Get some rest," he said, his voice softening slightly as he turned to her. "We'll talk in the morning. We need to decipher that book." He showed her to a bedroom, a spacious, airy room with a large bed and a balcony overlooking the sea. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of water stretching out to the horizon, a calming contrast to the turmoil within her. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "For everything." He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Get some sleep, Livia," he said. "You're safe here." He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Livia stood by the window, gazing out at the sea, the rhythmic sound of the waves a soothing lullaby. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but her mind was racing, replaying the events of the night, the attack on Raphael's man, the flight from Rome, the growing threat of the Salernus. She eventually changed into a soft nightgown she found in one of the drawers and slipped beneath the covers of the bed. The sheets were cool and smooth against her skin, a welcome comfort. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet her mind, to find some semblance of peace. But sleep wouldn't come. Her thoughts kept returning to Raphael, to the bloodstain on his sleeve, to the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his stoic facade. She wondered about his life, about the burdens he carried, about the secrets he held close to his heart. She rose from the bed and walked out onto the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief against her skin. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the sea, illuminating the landscape with an ethereal light. She saw him then, standing on the beach below, his silhouette outlined against the shimmering water. He was shirtless, his broad shoulders and muscular back gleaming in the moonlight. He was tending to his wound, a long, angry gash on his arm, the source of the bloodstain she had noticed earlier. She watched him, her heart aching for him, for the pain he was enduring, for the loneliness he must feel. She wanted to go to him, to offer him comfort, to tend to his wound, to ease his burden. But she hesitated, unsure of her place, unsure of how he would react. He finished cleaning the wound and bandaged it with a strip of cloth he had torn from his shirt. He stood there for a moment, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. Then he looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the distance. He hadn't seen her, she was sure of it, but in that moment, their eyes locked, and a connection sparked between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. He did not look surprised. It was as if he knew she would be there. And that silent conversation was more intimate than any touch. He needed her, she knew, and she needed him, but the price they would have to pay. Livia was not sure they would be able to pay it. She shivered, and not from the cold. Chapter 13. Masks and Midnight Confessions. The intensity of their shared gaze across the moonlit distance was broken only by the sound of a distant wave crashing against the shore. Livia felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see straight through her, into the depths of her soul. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that had settled over her, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked back towards the villa, his movements slow and deliberate. She watched him disappear into the shadows, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and apprehension. She retreated back into the bedroom, closing the balcony doors behind her. She climbed back into bed, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, of fear and desire, of duty and passion. She heard the soft click of the door opening, and her heart skipped a beat. Raphael stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dim light of the hallway. He had put on a clean shirt, but the bandage on his arm was still visible, a stark reminder of the violence that surrounded them. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She shook her head, unable to speak, her throat tight with unspoken emotions. He moved into the room, closing the door softly behind him. He stood by the bed, looking down at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that made her heart race. "I saw you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "On the beach." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know." A silence fell between them, heavy and charged with unspoken tension. It was a silence filled with the weight of their shared experiences, with the forbidden attraction that simmered between them, with the dangers that lurked just beyond the walls of their temporary sanctuary. "Why didn't you tell me you were hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of weariness. "It's nothing," he repeated, the lie sounding hollow even to his own ears. "It's not nothing," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "You were bleeding. You could have gotten an infection." He sat down on the edge of the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I'm used to it, Livia," he said, his voice low and strained. "This is my life. It's always been this way." His words were a stark reminder of the differences between them, of the worlds they came from. She had lived a sheltered life, a life of privilege and comfort, until her father's empire had crumbled. He had lived a life of violence and danger, a life where survival depended on strength and ruthlessness. "But it doesn't have to be this way," she said, her voice filled with a sudden surge of hope. "We can find another way. We can escape. Together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. "It's not that simple, Livia," he said softly. "We have responsibilities. Obligations. We can't just run away." "But why not?" she pressed, her voice urgent. "Why can't we just leave it all behind? The tesoro, the families, the violence?" He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "Because it's in our blood, Livia," he murmured, his voice a husky whisper. "It's who we are. We can't escape our past. We can only try to survive it." His words were a cold shower of reality, a reminder of the insurmountable obstacles they faced. But they also contained a hint of something else, a hint of resignation, of acceptance, of a life lived on the edge of a knife. He was not a man of many words, but his eyes, his touch, spoke for him. And Livia was starting to understand. "I wish things were different," he whispered. And she knew he was not talking about the tesoro, or their families.
He was talking about them.
Chapter 14. The Unraveling of Old Wounds. His whispered confession, raw and vulnerable, hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. Livia's heart ached for him, for the life he had been forced to live, for the burdens he carried, for the loneliness that she sensed beneath his stoic facade. She reached out, her hand covering his, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "I know it's not easy." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, as if he were trying to find an answer to a question he hadn't even asked. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated his face, highlighting the lines of weariness around his eyes, the faint scar on his jaw, the bandage on his arm, the visible and invisible wounds of a life lived in the shadows. "My father," he began, his voice hesitant, his gaze shifting away from hers. "He was a hard man, ruthless. He taught me everything I know. He taught me how to survive, how to fight, how to kill." His words were a stark reminder of the violence that permeated his world, the brutal reality that he had been forced to embrace from a young age. Livia shivered, imagining the young Raphael, forced to learn the harsh lessons of survival in a world where weakness was a death sentence. "But he also taught me about loyalty," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "About family, about protecting what's yours." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "That's why I'm doing this, Livia," he said. "That's why I'm protecting you. Because you're part of my family now. By a twisted bond. Because your father, he saved my grandfather's life. Years ago, during a war between the families. A war that almost destroyed us all."
"And
"The tesoro?" Livia asked. "The tesoro is the key to maintain peace. Or to unleash a new war. It depends on who finds it first." Raphael looked at her. "And I intend to be the first," He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. "I won't let them hurt you, Livia," he murmured, his voice a husky whisper. "I promise you that." His words were a vow, a solemn pledge, spoken with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver through her. She believed him. She trusted him. Despite everything, despite the dangers, despite the forbidden attraction that simmered between them, she trusted him with her life. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. She was overwhelmed by his vulnerability, by his willingness to share his past, his pain, with her. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse into the man beneath the ruthless Costaire, a man who is capable of loyalty, of compassion, of love. The question hung in the air, unspoken, unanswered. But the answer was there in his eyes, in his touch, in the way he looked at her, as if she were the only thing that mattered in the world. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. It was a kiss different from the one before, less desperate, more tender. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain, of growing trust, of a connection that was deepening with every passing moment, with every shared secret, with every whispered confession. It started to rain outside. The sound of the rain against the windows was like a melody of a love that was blooming in the middle of a storm. Chapter 15. A pact forged in fire. The kiss lingered, a sweet, tender exploration, a silent conversation between two souls who had found solace in each other's arms. The rain outside intensified, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore a dramatic backdrop to their intimate moment. It was a kiss that spoke of shared vulnerability, of growing trust, of a connection that defied logic and reason, a bond forged in the crucible of danger and desire. They eventually broke apart, their breaths mingling in the quiet space between them, their eyes locked in a gaze that held a mixture of longing and uncertainty. The reality of their situation, the dangers that surrounded them, the forbidden nature of their attraction, loomed large, casting a shadow over their fragile connection. Raphael was the first to speak, his voice husky with emotion. "We need to be careful, Livia," he said, his hand gently caressing her cheek. "This what's happening between us, it can't distract us. It can't make us weak." She nodded, her heart aching with the truth of his words. They were walking a tightrope, balanced precariously between their growing feelings and the harsh realities of their world. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, could cost them everything. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "but I can't help how I feel." He smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Neither can I," he admitted, his voice low and rough. The honesty of his confession, the vulnerability he displayed, sent a warmth spreading through her chest, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness that surrounded them. It was a dangerous hope, a fragile hope, but it was a hope nonetheless. "We need to focus on the book," he said, his voice regaining its usual firmness, his hand dropping from her cheek. "We need to decipher your father's clues. We need to find the tesoro before the Salernists do." She nodded, her mind reluctantly shifting back to the task at hand. The tesoro, the key to their survival, the object of their enemy's desire, was still out there, waiting to be found. "Let's go back to the study," she suggested, her voice gaining strength. "We can work together. We can figure it out." He agreed, and they left the bedroom, moving through the silent villa towards the study, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm that mirrored the beat of their hearts. They spent the rest of the night poring over the leather-bound book, deciphering the coded entries, piecing together the fragments of her father's secret legacy. Raphael's knowledge of codes and ciphers, combined with Livia's intimate knowledge of her father's life, his habits, his passions, proved to be a powerful combination. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to unravel the mystery, to follow the trail of breadcrumbs that Alessandro Marchesi had left behind. The book was a complex mixture of personal reflections, financial transactions, and cryptic references to locations, people, and events. It was a puzzle, a labyrinth, a treasure map that led them on a journey through her father's past, through the tangled web of alliances and betrayals that had defined his life. As the hours passed, they worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by occasional questions, observations, and shared moments of understanding. They were two minds, two souls, working together, united by a common goal, by a shared danger, by a growing, unspoken bond. By the time the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, they had made significant progress. They had identified several key locations, several names that seemed to be connected to the Tesoro. They had a plan. A dangerous plan, but a plan nonetheless. Raphael looked at Livia, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We're getting closer," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're going to find it, Livia. I promise you." She nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They were closer, yes, but they were also closer to danger, closer to the confrontation that awaited them. They had forged a pact sealed in fire, in the heat of their shared passion, in the crucible of their shared struggle. And they would face whatever came next together. She looked at him, and she knew. They were ready. Chapter 16. Echoes of Loyalty and Lies. The dawn brought with it a fragile sense of hope, a temporary reprieve from the darkness that had enveloped them. The rain had stopped, the clouds had parted, and the sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow over the villa and the sea. But the beauty of the morning couldn't completely dispel the tension that hung in the air, the underlying sense of danger that was their constant companion. They ate a quick breakfast in silence, their minds preoccupied with the task ahead. The deciphered clues from her father's book had led them to a specific location, an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of Rome, a place with a dark history, a place rumored to be haunted by the ghosts of the past. "San Giorgio in Velabro," Raphael said, his voice thoughtful as he studied a map of the city. "It's been abandoned for decades. No one goes there." "My father used to mention it," Livia said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He said it was a place of secrets. A place where deals were made, where alliances were forged and broken." The church, it seemed, was more than just a religious building. It was a symbol, a meeting place, a repository of hidden histories, a place where the lines between the sacred and the profane blurred. "We need to go there," Raphael said, his voice firm. "Today." Before the Salernus figured out. Livia nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was it. The next step in their dangerous journey. The next clue in their quest to find the Tesoro. They left the villa, driving back towards Rome, the city looming on the horizon, a concrete jungle filled with both promise and peril. The drive was silent, each lost in their own thoughts, preparing for the challenges that awaited them. They reached the church in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the crumbling facade. The building was a ruin, its walls overgrown with ivy, its windows broken, its doors hanging open, a testament to years of neglect and decay. It was a place of forgotten memories, of whispered secrets, of lingering shadows. Raphael parked the car a discreet distance away, hidden from view. They approached the church on foot, moving cautiously through the overgrown grounds, their senses on high alert. They slipped inside the church, the musty air hitting them like a physical blow. The interior was dark and cavernous, the only light filtering through the broken windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet and the distant sounds of the city. "Stay close to me," Raphael whispered, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of protection that sent a shiver through her. They began to search, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the faded frescoes on the walls, the crumbling altar, the rows of empty pews. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of old wood and damp stone, a testament to the passage of time and the ravages of neglect. They searched for hours, their hope dwindling with each passing minute. The church seemed empty, devoid of any clues, any sign of her father's hidden legacy. Just as they were about to give up, Livia noticed something, a small, almost imperceptible inscription on one of the pillars supporting the crumbling roof. It was a series of numbers, barely visible beneath the layers of dust and grime. "Raphael," she whispered, her voice filled with excitement.
Look.
He moved closer, his flashlight beam illuminating the inscription. He recognized it immediately. "It's a code," he said, his voice low and thoughtful.
A date.
"And a time." The date was today's date. The time was midnight. "It is a message," Livia said, "a rendezvous." "But with who?" Raphael asked. He did not have time to finish the sentence. A noise coming from outside made them freeze. Someone was there, and they were not alone. The question now was, friend or foe? Chapter 17. The storm within and without. The sudden noise, a distinct crunch of gravel underfoot, shattered the silence of the abandoned church, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Livia and Raphael. They exchanged a look, their eyes communicating a shared understanding of the danger they were in. They weren't alone, and whoever was out there was unlikely to be friendly. Raphael quickly extinguished his flashlight, plunging them into near total darkness. He motioned for Livia to stay behind him, his body shielding hers, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. He moved silently towards the nearest window, peering out cautiously, trying to get a glimpse of their uninvited guest. Livia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears. She strained her senses, listening for any further sound, any indication of who was out there and how many. The Salernus? The police? Or someone else entirely? The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast an eerie, shifting light over the overgrown grounds surrounding the church. Raphael saw movement shadows flitting between the crumbling tombstones, the glint of metal reflecting the moonlight. More than one. At least 3.
Armed.
"Salernus," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his breath warm against her ear. "They found us." Livia's blood ran cold. The Salernus. Their worst nightmare had come true. They were trapped, cornered, outnumbered. Their chances of escape seemed slim. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Raphael didn't answer immediately. He was assessing the situation, calculating their options, weighing the risks. He knew that a direct confrontation would be suicidal. They needed to find another way out, a way to evade their pursuers, a way to survive. "There's a crypt," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Beneath the altar. It's our only chance." A crypt, a dark, enclosed space, a place of death and decay. The thought sent a shiver down Livia's spine. But she knew he was right. It was their only hope. He led her quickly and silently towards the crumbling altar, his hand gripping hers tightly, his presence a source of strength and reassurance in the face of overwhelming fear. He located a hidden lever, concealed behind a loose stone, and pulled it. A section of the floor beneath the altar slid open, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the depths of the crypt. "Go," he urged, pushing her gently towards the opening. "I'll be right behind you." Livia hesitated, her fear battling with her trust in him. She didn't want to leave him, didn't want to face the darkness alone.
But she knew she had to.
She descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The darkness was absolute, pressing down on her, suffocating her. Raphael followed close behind, pulling the lever to close the entrance to the crypt, sealing them in the darkness. They were trapped, hidden, but also vulnerable. They stood there for a moment, their breaths mingling in the silence, their hearts pounding in unison. The sounds of the Salernus searching the church above them echoed down into the crypt, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the stone walls. Outside, the wind picked, whistling through the broken church windows. It started as a breeze and escalated into a roar, mimicking the sounds of their pursuers. Raphael touched Livia's hand. "We'll wait them out,"
he whispered.
Livia nodded. They had to. The storm inside her and the storm outside the church were mirroring each other. How long they will have to wait. Chapter 18. revelation in the ruins. The weight in the suffocating darkness of the crypt was an agonizing test of their nerves. Every creak of the floorboards above, every muffled shout from the Salernus, sent a fresh wave of fear through Livia. She clung to Raphael's hand, his presence her only anchor in the swirling vortex of terror. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, a claustrophobic reminder of their confinement. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity. Minutes felt like hours. The silence between them was punctuated only by the sounds of their breathing and the distant, ominous noises from above. Livia's mind raced, imagining the Salernus searching the church, their frustration growing with each passing moment, their determination to find them hardening. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the sounds above began to fade. The shouts became more distant, the footsteps less frequent. Raphael listened intently, his senses on high alert. "They're leaving," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They think we're gone." A wave of relief washed over Livia, so intense that it almost made her weak. They had survived. For now. But the reprieve was temporary. They were still trapped in the crypt, still hunted by the Salernus, still far from safety. Raphael waited a few minutes longer, ensuring that the coast was clear, before he cautiously opened the hidden entrance to the crypt. They emerged back into the church, blinking in the dim light that filtered through the broken windows. The church was a mess, evidence of the Salernus' thorough and violent search. Pews had been overturned, religious artifacts smashed, the altar desecrated. The scene was a stark reminder of the brutality of their enemies, of the lengths they would go to in order to find the tesoro. "We need to get out of here," Raphael said, his voice urgent. "Before they come back." They moved quickly and silently towards the side entrance, their senses on high alert. As they were about to slip out into the night, Livia stopped, her gaze drawn to something she had missed earlier. It was a small, almost unnoticeable detail, a faint inscription on the wall, hidden behind a tapestry that the Salernus had ripped down during their search. It was the same series of numbers they had seen on the pillar, the date and time midnight. But there was something else, a single word, written in faded Latin: veritas.
Truth.
Livia's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The final clue. The key to understanding her father's message. "Raphael," she whispered, her voice filled with excitement.
"Look."
He moved closer, his flashlight beam illuminating the inscription. He studied it for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Midnight," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Tonight. Here. Veritas, truth. It's a meeting. A rendezvous. Your father, he was going to meet someone here. Tonight. Someone who knew about the tesoro." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just searching for the tesoro. They were walking into a trap, a carefully laid plan orchestrated by her father, a plan that had been set in motion years ago. But who? Livia asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Who was he meeting? Raphael shook his head, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're about to find out." He looked at his watch. It was almost midnight. "We have to hide." Now, he said. They had a few minutes and a big decision to take. Stay and face whoever was coming? Or run away and maybe losing the only chance to discover the truth? Livia looked at Raphael, searching for an answer in his eyes. But this time, Raphael was as lost as she was. The choice was theirs. And time was running out. Chapter 19. The Serpent's True Face. The decision weighed heavily on them. The weight of their past, their present, and their uncertain future pressing down on them in the suffocating silence of the ruined church. Stay and face the unknown, or run and risk losing their only lead. The clock was ticking, each second bringing them closer to midnight, closer to the rendezvous that Alessandro Marchesi had arranged years ago. "We stay," Livia said, her voice firm, her decision made. She couldn't run, not anymore. She needed answers. She needed closure. She needed to understand her father's legacy, even if it meant facing danger head-on. Raphael nodded, his respect for her growing. He had expected her to choose flight, to prioritize safety, but she had chosen courage, had chosen to confront the unknown. He saw in her a strength that mirrored his own, a determination that burned bright despite the fear that gnawed at them both. "All right," he said, his voice low and steady. "We stay. But we stay hidden. We observe. We don't reveal ourselves unless we know who we're dealing with." They found a hiding place behind a large, crumbling statue of a saint, a shadowy alcove that offered a limited view of the church's main entrance. They crouched down, their bodies pressed close together, their senses on high alert. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. The silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant rumble of the city. The moon, now fully visible through the broken windows, cast an eerie, silvery light over the scene, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the broken pews, the desecrated altar. Then, they heard the sound of a car approaching, its headlights sweeping across the overgrown grounds. The car stopped, its engine silenced. A door slammed. Footsteps echoed on the gravel path. Livia and Raphael held their breath, their hearts pounding in unison. The church door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a dark suit. He moved with a confident stride, his head held high, his gaze sweeping over the ruined interior. He stopped in the center of the church, his back to them. Livia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. She recognized him.
It couldn't be, but it was.
"Donatella," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath catching in her throat. Raphael's eyes widened in disbelief. Donatella Salerni, the head of the Salerni family. Their enemy. The man who had ordered the attack on his men, the man who was hunting them, the man who wanted the tesoro. But there was something else, something that Livia couldn't quite decipher. A sense of familiarity. A hint of sadness? It was in the way he stood, in the way he held himself, in the way his gaze lingered on the faded frescoes, on the crumbling altar. He spoke, his voice echoing through the silent church. "Alessandro," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and regret. "I'm here, as you asked." Livia's mind reeled. Her father had arranged a meeting with Donatella Salerni? His enemy? The man who had supposedly betrayed him? It didn't make sense. Unless Donatella Salerni wasn't his enemy. Unless he was something else. Raphael was looking at her, with a questioning gaze. Livia had no time to answer him. "I know you are here, Livia," Donatella said. He turned around. His eyes met Livia's gaze. "Come out. It's time you know the truth." His voice was surprisingly gentle. But what truth he was talking about? Chapter 20. A crown of thorns and triumphs. Donatella Salerni's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, a challenge, and an invitation all in one. Livia's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. Her father, meeting with his sworn enemy, the head of the Salerni family, speaking with such gentleness? It was a revelation that shattered everything she thought she knew about her past, about her family, about the world she inhabited. She looked at Raphael, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. He gave her a slight nod, a silent signal of support, of trust. They would face this together, whatever it was. She stepped out from behind the crumbling statue, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze locked on Donatella Salerni. Raphael followed close behind, his hand resting on the small of her back, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. "Donatella," Livia said, her voice trembling slightly, but holding a note of defiance. "What is this? What do you want?" Donatella Salerni studied her, his gaze intense and unwavering. He was an older man, his hair silvered at the temples, his face lined with the marks of time and experience. But his eyes held a depth of emotion that surprised her, a mixture of sadness, regret, and something else. Something that looked like love? "I want to tell you the truth, Livia," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "The truth about your father. About our families. About everything." He gestured towards the crumbling altar. "This place," he said, his voice echoing through the silent church. It holds many secrets, many memories. It was here years ago that your father and we made a pact. A pact to protect our families, to protect our city from a greater threat. Livia frowned, her confusion growing. A pact? With you? But you were enemies. Donatella shook his head slowly. That's what everyone believed, Livia, he said. That's what we wanted them to believe. It was a facade, a carefully constructed lie, designed to protect us and to protect you. He took a deep breath, his gaze locking with hers. Your father, Alessandro Marchesi, and we were more than just rivals, Livia, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. We were brothers, not by blood but by choice, by a bond that was stronger than any blood tie. Livia gasped, her knees almost giving way beneath her. Brothers? Her father and Donatella Salerni? It was impossible, unthinkable, and yet it explained so much. The secret meetings, the coded messages, the hidden tesoro, the unexpected protection from Raphael the Tesoro. Donatella continued, his voice filled with emotion. It wasn't just money, Livia. It was proof. Proof of our agreement, proof of our loyalty to each other, proof of our commitment to peace. And it was also insurance, a way to protect our families in case something happened to one of us. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Your father knew he was dying, Livia, he said softly. He knew he wouldn't be able to protect you himself. So he entrusted me with the tesoro, with the truth, with the responsibility of keeping you safe. Tears welled in Livia's eyes, tears of grief, of confusion, of a strange, overwhelming relief. Her father hadn't betrayed her. He had protected her in the only way he knew how. He had entrusted her to his closest friend, his brother in all but blood, the man she had always believed to be her enemy. The truth. It was painful, but it was also liberating. Livia looked at Raphael, and she smiled sadly. They had been so wrong. About everything. But finally, they knew. And Raphael? She asked, turning back to Donatella. Raphael is part of this, too. He's following the path we designed, Donatella said, glancing at Raphael. Raphael nodded, his eyes filled with understanding and a grim determination. Livia took Raphael's hand. The storm was over. A new day was about to begin. Donatella approached Livia. He took her hands. Your father was a great man, Livia. And he loved you very much. Never forget that. Livia nodded. She would never forget that. It was the end. But it was also a beginning. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. The revelation in the ruined church had shattered old alliances and forged new ones, rewriting the landscape of Rome's underworld and forever changing the lives of Livia and Raphael. The tesoro, once a symbol of fear and uncertainty, became a catalyst for change. It was used not for personal gain, but to rebuild, to heal, to create a new order, a new balance of power, based not on violence and betrayal, but on trust and cooperation. Donatella Salerni, once Livia's sworn enemy, became a mentor, a guide, a father figure, filling the void left by Alessandro's death. He revealed the full extent of his secret alliance with Alessandro, the sacrifices they had made, the risks they had taken to protect their families and maintain a fragile peace. Raphael, freed from the burden of his family's legacy of violence, embraced a new path, a path of leadership guided by compassion and a commitment to justice. He used his intelligence, his strength, his strategic mind, not to dominate and control, but to build and protect. He became the man Livia had always sensed he could be, a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man worthy of her love. And Livia blossomed. The broken Marchesi princess, the ghost of Palazzo Marchesi, found her voice, her strength, her purpose. She embraced her heritage, not as a burden, but as a source of power. She became a leader in her own right, a force for good, a champion of the innocent, a voice for the voiceless. She and Raphael, their love forged in the crucible of danger and desire, built a life together, A life based on mutual respect, on shared values, on a deep, abiding affection that transcended their family's past, their rivalries, their differences. They married, in a quiet ceremony, attended only by their closest friends and family, a symbolic union of two worlds, a testament to the power of love to overcome even the most deeply entrenched hatreds. They returned to the Palazzo Marchesi, not as ghosts, but as restorers, breathing new life into the old, crumbling walls, transforming it from a symbol of loss and decay into a beacon of hope and renewal. They filled its rooms with laughter, with love, with the echoes of a new generation, a generation free from the shadows of the past. They often visited the abandoned church, San Giorgio in Velebro, the place where their lives had been forever changed, the place where the truth had been revealed. They would stand there, hand in hand, gazing at the crumbling walls, at the faded frescoes, at the spot where Donatella Salerni had revealed the secret that had bound their families together. It was a reminder of the past, of the pain, of the sacrifices, but it was also a reminder of the future, of the hope, of the possibilities. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of ruins, truth could blossom, and love could conquer all. The wounds were still there, but they were healing, and Livia and Raphael were finally free. Free to love, free to live, free to build a new legacy. A legacy of hope, of peace, of enduring love. They were looking at the future, finally, hand in hand, and their eyes were shining with the promise of a new, brighter day.